it's really a great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker today. He is Ambassador Dr. Barfuor Adjei-Barwuah. He is Ghana's ambassador to the US. He presented his credentials to President Trump in 2017, having served earlier as Ghana's ambassador to Japan. Ambassador Barwuah is an academic with a bachelor's degree in geography from the University of Ghana in Legon, a master's degree from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and a PhD from Indiana University in Bloomington. He has served as professor and first dean of the business school at the African University College of Communications. He's also served in academia in various roles in government in England and also in Ghana. Ambassador Adjei-Barwuah is a great friend of WPI. He's been personally involved in helping our programs in Ghana and a truly great friend of WPI. And so with that, it's truly a pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Ambassador Adjei-Barwuah of Ghana. Thank you very much. Ambassador. Rachel, are you there?
We're here, Wally. We can't start the video.
Okay.
So I'm set. No, start the video a bit.
Sorry.
Should I have to say that?
Yeah, I tried it. It doesn't work.
Okay.
Maybe I should.
You're on.
Go on. Okay.
Just ask them to advance the slide. Just ask them to advance the slide.
To
Advance the slide.
okay. Sure. Okay.
Okay, you're on.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Sobuyejo, for the introduction. I have to tell you that listening to you, I've probably learned more than I have learned about Africa and whatnot over a long period. And besides that, I've also been seriously educated as to the breadth of WPI's involvement insofar as Africa's fortunes are concerned. I consider myself very privileged to be here today, and especially for the purposes of this seminar, because for me as a Ghanaian, recognizing what is it that the WPI is doing in Ghana, and then learning on top of that, the fact that the WPI is also very seriously engaged in other parts of Africa, is particularly heartwarming. And I would submit that indeed the presentation that Professor excuse me, Sobuyejo put out constitutes probably the prop that we on the continent need insofar as developing our own fortunes of advancement is concerned. My privilege in being here revolves around the fact that for all that is going on, I would want to more or less concentrate on, as it were, putting the spokes in the wheel insofar as WPI's efforts are concerned, because I consider it part of my responsibility to raise the issues which would normally be associated with this kind of effort, but probably wouldn't gain a lot of exposure in the honest process of people trying to do what they are intending to do. In that wise, and if you may flip the first slide for me, yeah. The effort being made here can only be couched in or by way of an opportunity to develop novel methodologies and platforms for cooperation in the development and expansion of scientific knowledge, with a view to exploring new avenues for technological advancement to support socioeconomic development in Africa in particular, and the world at large. And what that means that we have to recognize, and this was mentioned by the earlier speaker, that a lot had gone on in Africa long before this. And the issue usually revolves around the fact that, and most of you probably have been in classes where you always have one or two precocious students who raise pertinent questions that probably most teachers wouldn't want to look at. And it has to do with this. A good African teacher, in trying to defend whatever Africa's past has been, would submit that when the Europeans were in caves, Africans were performing surgical procedures in places like Khartoum and whatnot. And the precocious student would immediately react. And what happened? Because the recession in that kind of advancement of knowledge is phenomenal. So, as far as the underdevelopment, as it were, of the continent is concerned, we sometimes take the easier road of blaming people that we call colonialists or what have you for what is it that has happened on the continent. In that case, one would also want to bag onto this. The fact that if you examine Western economic policies over the years, consistently, theories have been tweaked to ensure that in some ways, Africa is kept to the advantage of the others against the interest of the Africans themselves. So one would usually surmise that economic policies across the globe have always been tweaked to make it difficult for Africans to pop out of poverty. And I do bow to the fact that poverty lends itself to a whole mess or a whole mass of interpretation. And to a certain extent also, we as Africans ought to hold ourselves responsible for part of the problem. Because, in my view, most of us have not done enough to struggle to get out of the predicament, as it were, that we have been in and we still are in. So, what probably I'm trying to lead to is, as it were, poking the issues which WPI would need to look at in the context of WPI's genuine effort to help bridge the gap between the developed section of the world and the so-called underdeveloped sections of the world. And in a certain extent, we have run into another disadvantage of the fact that technology has developed so fast that most of Africa has been caught into it at a time when, in fact, most of Africa hasn't even managed to, as it were, get the act together to the point of developing nations. Most of us, what we've succeeded in doing is maintaining the geographic integrity of the countries that emerged from the post-colonial era. So the whole idea of nations and the interests of nations and trying to carve, some kind of a charter course for development is still something that we are working on. And then we are caught in this fast-paced development as far as technology and information systems are concerned. So now we are not even trying, as it were, to catch up. We are being asked basically to leapfrog. And the leapfrogging comes with its own difficulties. For example, at the moment, people are developing driverless vehicles. It seems that within the next couple of decades, maybe the kinds of vehicles that we drive on the African continent are going to be obsolete. And of course, one has to recognize that industry itself is always planned on some kind of a planned obsolescence. But then, if our vehicles are going to be that obsolete, maintenance is going to be expensive. And then also, developing the technology to catch up is going to be more than difficult. So for instance, I may own a car now, and I realized that, well, the best thing I could do is to try and find one of the new driverless vehicles. And in trying to get to my hometown, maybe a few kilometers down the road, I will have a message on the dashboard that I'm sorry, I wasn't designed for this kind of road, and therefore I'm unable to go any further. That is one of the little problems that could befall us. But the issue is, what do we do to catch up? And I have a feeling that what we do ought to be part of the issue that WPI is trying to look at. And it basically then means that WPI's effort ought to include a certain kind of pivoted attempt to try and bring the technological gap that we have through the kinds of research and development that needs to be done. The concept at the moment of the 18th century nation state appears to be coming to the fore. So when nations are talking about the defense of their own specific interest, obviously it takes a lot out of what is it that institutions like WPI could make to sustain or to support developments on the African continent. And therefore, that constitutes part of the responsibility or the effort or the schedule that WPI ought to consider in this whole business of looking at technological advancement to support Africa's own situation. The innovation ought to be a little bit extra to what is it that probably we have now. But then I think that is a question of time. And I also believe that the WPI hasn't gone into this expecting that it is going to be some kind of a smooth walkover. It's not a Sunday walk. And I really would want to take the opportunity to applaud WPI for making that kind of intervention, especially where WPI is spread across the continent, which actually is a very heartwarming effort. That said, It basically means that the obstacle that I'm looking at, and you may flip the next slide for me, please. The obstacle that I'm looking at is that the challenge to WPI ought to be molded to be a certain kind of exemplar in genuine effort in innovation and cooperation. There's a certain kind of InnoCorp program worthy of support by the institution itself and worthy of emulation by other institutions of higher learning and those interested or committed to global advancement and peace. Because one has to submit that unless there is a sustained effort at peace building, the whole idea of even having the environment to contend with what is it that one should do across the globe to maintain a certain kind of advancement in general, development across the world is going to be obviously underscored. And therefore, where WPI is pitching its tent would have to be so defined, so solid, and so detailed that yes, we might miss a few, but then at least the majority of the effort would be tackled because the relationships between the WPI and the institutions and the countries would obviously dovetail into whatever it is that one needs to do to improve the fortunes of the world at large. Sub-Saharan Africa has always been the basis for global prosperity. More or less, we probably would qualify to be described as the hewers of wood and the drawers of water for the other areas of the world. And nobody is going to, as it will, make a bit of a challenge to the fact that, yes, a lot of countries have developed more or less on the sweat of the African continent. And for instance, if you look at the fact that Zaire as a country used to be called the Belgian Congo, belonged first to the King of Belgium. And please take note of the fact that the whole of Western Europe, if it could be picked up and dropped into Zaire now, there will be more space left. That is, the Congo or the Zaire is bigger in terms of physical geographic expansion than the whole of Western Europe put together. It belonged to one man. And what is it that went on there could be used as explanatory point for the fact that it is still in the state that it is. That is not to beg the fact that over the years, maybe one could argue that we haven't made some significant effort to develop the countries as we had them at the time of independence. But I still believe that even current economic policies and economic theories and whatnot are usually shifted to make sure that Africa remains a source of raw materials and not more or less an industrial competitor. Because one has to probably submit and get some kind of hearing to the fact that unless there is some kind of systematic industrialization in any country, improvement insofar as socioeconomic conditions are concerned is always going to be compromised. So again, I believe that the WPI has taken a bite on a rather very serious issue, and that the WPI in that case is prepared to a certain extent to be focused and especially to be radical, because of the fact that we are not talking about issues which you can take palliative measures and believe that certain matters could be sorted. That is not to scare WPI, but to at least get WPI to steel herself to the fact that what WPI is trying to do is probably what is it that the world needs to do. And WPI in that case is charting the course, for these kinds of things to be taken in. I would want to beg your indulgence if I sound like I'm not exactly academic, and if I sound like I'm more political or social oriented. But as I said, on the basis of the earlier presentation, I ought to be the one to poke, the holes into the tablet for one to realize that it is not going to be a Sunday ride insofar as WPI's effort, is concerned. So, in going into some kind of research relationships with institutions on the African continent, one has to define exactly where the research frontiers are. What do we do? What are we looking at? What are the objectives? How do we define the problem? Because in most research, that exactly is the starting point. What exactly is the problem? The problem is that we have a continent seriously big with a population that is growing faster than we would prefer, with a certain kind of age structure that says we are going to be predominantly, youthful. And these days, because of technological advancements and, marketing efforts, from other areas, our younger population has developed a certain voracious appetite for virtually anything. And therefore, in trying to sort out a certain kind of, path for socioeconomic development, we sometimes are probably talking about a situation where we have to rectify the relationships between the ability to consume in terms of incomes and the intent or the will to consume items, which probably most people that we are going to be talking about can't afford. Now that becomes, an intractable issue because we have to relate these things to people's interpretation of either wealth or poverty, and people's interpretation of what they consider to be either their standard of living as opposed to the quality of their living. And I will submit to you, and it's one of the painful things that I sometimes think about, is that we seem to have a situation where currently most youthful people on the continent appear to be believing that the money in one's pocket is not necessarily related to one's effort by way of work or what have you. People want to spend. How the money gets in is a different thing. And then also in terms of people defining their class, you realize that in certain countries, the average person, for instance, gets out of the university without a wife, without probably, a defined girlfriend, without a bicycle, without a car. But if you are talking to that person about living conditions for them, they are going to be talking to you about a 3-bedroom house, a 2-car garage, for a person who doesn't even own a bicycle. And people believe that it is a legitimate, position to take. So in setting out the research frontier, part of it probably is going to be sociological in terms of people's attitudes to their own definition of their station in life and how that translates into the general operation of the economies and the society that they are in. Now that could be a whole wax that the WPI could help, as it were, melt down. And that in itself is not going to be a very easy, proposition to handle. And then, of course, one would have to, maybe in the process, put in the kind of education which says that some of us must of necessity generate a certain kind of trimming process for what we expect out of life. Now that is where probably the WPI would have to be radical in the context of the research that the WPI does. Because if that doesn't happen, we will basically always come to square one. Because when we start the argument today, and the next thing you know is that people are paying to take a ride to, a space station or something. There are going to be people who, without, even the resources to buy themselves a decent motor vehicle, would also be aiming at going to, the space station to find out how the world looks like, from there. So we on the continent have a problem of excessive expectations without the requisite, income, the requisite research purposes, the requisite, backup to engage in that. Now, these are the kinds of things that ought to have a certain kind of impression, a certain kind of influence on how the WPI establishes the research frontier and how the WPI relates to those institutions and individuals on the African continent who are supposed to be partners in looking at the problems, that we have, with a view to ensuring that there is a certain kind of modicum of respect and peace on the continent. Not everybody is going to be asking for the moon, but everybody would want to see it. And the thing is, in our culture, in our language, we say that nobody ever teaches a child where God is. So to a certain extent, we may understand our own problems, but sometimes the direction, the support, the influence, and the effort to help define the proper, parameters of the problem is what is lacking, and that is where the WPI, in concert with people on the continent who also ought to know, who also ought to understand, would obviously, come into play. So I think what I'm driving at has to do with, in a way, how do you put, the team together to examine these kinds of issues? It is a matter of fashioning the institutional and the personnel mix in the academic cooperation effort. Of course, one has to accept that whoever is from the WPI who would be working on the continent or is working on the continent would have been sent by the WPI because the WPI believes in their capabilities. The WPI believes in their mental situation. The WPI believes in the culture of the WPI as it is being transported or transferred into these areas. But then also, we are all human. Sometimes the chemistry matters. Sometimes a certain acceptance of the possibility that the other person is a little more knowledgeable and a little better also happens. I have always made a certain contention. Sometimes I say it in jest, but sometimes I believe it. And I have never met a Ghanaian who believes that the other person is smarter. So if you have to be in that kind of mode, it is going to be very difficult for even to interpret the word cooperation, let alone see a meeting of minds that will generate genuine innovation, looking at the same problem or similar problems. So to a certain extent, I'm not envying those of you who, in very practical terms, are going to be involved in these kinds of exchanges with counterparts on the African continent. But my belief is that for one to take on that kind of challenge, one is obviously, schooled or skilled in the knowledge that there is going to be the necessity for a certain kind of fusion between where the Africans are and where WPI, happens to be, and therefore the synergy that needs to be created. Because for most of the time, whatever it is that some Africans could do have always been sort of either sidestepped or ignored or what have you. And for those of us who have been to educational institutions in our own countries and in other countries, sometimes you can basically smell it, that there is a certain kind of disparity in either a certain kind of academic acceptance or academic respect, which in turn might affect the project that one is engaged in. Somehow or the other, knowing some of the staff in this institution, I don't have apprehensions about that at all. But there is always going to be a certain gingering effort between people when they meet first to discuss an issue. And therefore, they ought to come with a certain kind of near common understanding of the pith of the issue that is going to be, examined. I do believe that most of the, people that WPI will be working with on the African continent, and I do know that in the case of the Ghana situation, because of my conversations and whatnot with Professor Kruger, they have turned out to be okay. And maybe the okay ought to be upstaged to be more than okay, because that is where the crux of the issue is going to be, because human beings could be very funny. And therefore, especially where you might be looking at credits and whatnot, in an effort like in an academic effort, people can be a little wobbly insofar as their perspectives are concerned. So the personnel issue needs to be fashioned properly. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the whole trend of the research problem also ought to be defined. Because sometimes it might appear that even the issue that WPI would want to look at are issues that people in the system would consider to be, is that a problem? I used to work for the British government in a program where they wanted to access the long-term unemployed into work. And for that, every week, I had a flight of about 20 people who have been out of work for probably 4 years or so, to, as it were, take them through the whole world of work as they have, not come to know. And then on the last day of the week, I take them on individually to try and tease out if they have any specific problems. And then, of course, the reasons why they have been out of work for so long. And I noticed that almost every Friday, the ladies in the park always broke down in tears when they were discussing their issues with me. Now you ask what exactly the core problem is, and they tell me. I have to confess that after I've spoken with them and they've left, I just asked myself, why does she consider that a problem? And then I later on learned that, in fact, everybody has a certain kind of, tipping point, which I might not recognize. So what did I do? I decided to go and take a course in counseling, just to find out how one can draw one's mind, position it in one's circumstances, and then put myself in the middle and decide what could be the solution to that problem. Now, we can find that in situations like this, because we tend to, on the continent, look at some issues, but that is not a problem, until it festers to the point where it starts defying, solution. And I believe that in the academic environment, this also could be a certain kind of niggling problem that should be tackled in the initial, stages. I think the plea that I'm putting to WPI is that the WPI cannot take anything for granted, because one is looking at, for instance, the problems of gold prospecting and the issues that have arisen in terms of pollution of rivers, in terms of the use of certain chemicals, which are going to have repercussions on the populations in the areas and that kind of thing. And then, of course, the resultant defects that we would have in agricultural production and in other kinds of production. So we need to have that range to look at. And we ought to be in a position to, as it were, take cues from either side to make sure that we arrive at a solution that might be lasting enough, practical enough, and operational enough for those people in that environment to feel connected enough, to feel satisfied enough, to have a positive impact on the generality of the situations that we happen to be in. I'm not in a position to ask the WPI, go and solve all of Africa's problems. Nobody can. Nobody can single-handedly, save the world. But I think the request here is that WPI can save a little corner of where WPI is. And that salvation has to do with a certain kind of meaningful innovational cooperation between WPI as an institution and other institutions, and between WPI's operational staff and the operational staff of other institutions. Not so much because WPI owes it to Africa or anybody else, but WPI looking at it in terms of the kind of well-informed, the kind of well-established, the kind of well-committed educational institution that it is. That is where WPI would want to try and drive either the boat or whatever it is that one has to be looking at. Because Africa, whatever level that you take, is reasonably turbulent when it comes to making the effort to us to stabilize our situation in terms of socioeconomic development and in terms of being able to come a little closer to a certain level of parity with the rest of the world. I can tell you that there's this little story that we used to tell in secondary school, where when God was creating the world, he picks up gold, puts it in Africa, picks up diamonds, puts it in Africa, putting everything in Africa. And there was this, white guy who was a bit disturbed by that. So he approaches God and said, God, why? You are putting all these things into Africa. What are you giving us? Mountains, streams, cold, snow, and all that. What do you expect? How do you expect us to survive? So God calmly tells us, my son, don't worry. There are these fools that I'm going to put, on the other in the other place, and you then would have to go and take everything that I've put in there. Whether that is a true story or not, to a certain extent, it reflects some of the practicalities of our existence on this planet. So, what I think I'm trying to get you to understand, to feel, is that, yes, we have to understand, the past. Yes, we have to understand the failures and all that. But with the BPI's involvement and lead, we should not allow those to constitute impediments insofar as trying to find a way of clearing some of the difficulties on the planet are concerned. And I would want to believe that in the final analysis, what we are going to be looking at is a certain explosion of achievements which have resulted from a certain kind of cooperation, a certain kind of relationship, a certain kind of getting together that will provide some kind of solution, some kind of comfort, some kind of decorum for other people on the surface of the earth who so far have not come up to par insofar as the arrangements on the continent are concerned. That is not to say that anybody owes Africa a solution, because to a large extent, Africa ought to consider herself as qualified to stew in her own juice. But sometimes, some people could help provide, a better source of fire to do the stewing. And I think that WPI is in that kind of situation at the moment. That WPI has elected to provide the kind of lantern that may, brighten up the path in some of the forests of our continent. Now, we don't expect that you'll come and find some Africans with folded arms, expect, okay, so you've come, you want, go ahead. No. There ought to be a certain kind of active participation. Just as I've witnessed Professor Kruger and others do in Ghana. Because besides the whole sort of pumping effect that it has, the joy of seeing people with different backgrounds, with different upbringing, with different attitudes and all that, doing things for a common purpose is in itself, heartwarming. So, whilst one, is looking at, all this, one ought to, in that case, decide on what exactly are the markers are insofar as achievement or the ultimate goals are concerned. And I think, if you would, give me the other slide. The way I'm looking at it, and maybe it's one of these things that geographers sometimes indulge themselves in. I look at it in terms of the fact that you take, any river, and irrespective of the area that these rivers traverse, they all finally end up in a certain ocean or in a certain body of, water, in any of the continents, which basically says we all lead to one particular spot. And therefore, it doesn't matter if the river is running through, a seriously, endowed gold, terrain, or a seriously, deprived, what have you. And irrespective of the headwaters of those rivers, they all end up in this one cauldron of the larger mass of water, which means, to put it in very morbid terms, irrespective of your kind of lifestyle, irrespective of your standard of life, irrespective of how you finally pop out, we are always going to expect that it is either a little box with ashes or a longer box, 6 feet underground. So in some sense, we are in this together. And for me, that ought to be the backdrop of this philosophy with which the WPI is engaged in this. We welcome, the WPI's effort. We welcome the WPI's, views on what is it that we ought to be able to look at. Just that the WPI would, be welcoming to the kinds of views that we have insofar as the identified, problems are concerned. And in trying to, in that case, collaborate, in the areas that we are either qualified to look at, or in the areas that we would want to identify and take a stab at, we are always going to be bound by a certain intent that when it is all through, there ought to be a certain kind of shared, either happiness or joy, or a certain kind of, end product that we can all look at and feel proud that we were involved in trying to find that particular, solution. The academicians are sometimes a bit difficult. They are not social workers. But at least insofar as finding strategies and ways of sorting problems out, they could be, because of the necessity to, as it will, have a fine relationship between the two sides of a problem, or between the two involved individuals who seek to find a problem. Now, I have a feeling that what we have to do then is to decide what the markers for achievement are supposed to be, or what the ultimate goals are supposed to be. I have a feeling that the achievement has to do with a certain kind of comfort in the knowledge that yes, we got together. Yes, we genuinely tried to ease or eke a problem and find an answer. And even if we did not find the answer that puts that problem to bed, the thought that we've made a certain kind of advancement is part of the price. And besides that, we may probably not be handling issues that have ultimate goals per se, but we would be handling problems that create pathways for providing ultimate goals for the solution of other problems. We are not asking, and indeed, I'm not too sure that somebody or some people from the continent made a certain kind of honest request of WPI to do most of the things WPI is doing. WPI as an institution, a big institution, a well-established institution, an institution that wants to pursue knowledge, an institution that intends to bring whatever it has to the advantage of other people in different circumstances, decided on its own back that maybe these are areas that we have to take a look at in the effort to build a certain kind of global interrelationships that should make all of us reasonably comfortable, irrespective of which corner of the planet we are involved in. Now, for me, that is what academics is all about. For me, that is what an institution of this nature is all about. And for me, it makes it exceptionally sort of proud to know that there are institutions such as WPI prepared to take on what probably sometime might turn out to be some of the imponderables insofar as global existence is concerned. Now, maybe even just by sheer honest participation, that is a price that an institution like this ought to be looking for. And if that were so, I believe that in that case, WPI is going to have the prize. And those of us who become privileged enough to be associated in the quest for the prize would also feel that maybe the effort couldn't have been better and couldn't have been wasted. Now, to my kind of feeling and for my kind of experience and whatnot, one can only ask that the WPI honestly puts her craft, out there and expect reciprocation on the other side and find a way of making sure that when the balances are put on the table, most people are going to be pushing in the direction of WPI, because when others were not there, WPI was there. And I hope that this whole effort in search of certain kinds of technological and innovative issues to handle development in Africa would expect that when the certificates are being given, the top one will certainly come to WPI. I, again, would want to feel excessively privileged to be a part of this. And I'm hoping that when we all settle down to review what is it that we've been able to do, yes, we probably dreamed big or we didn't dream big. But we probably would also say that, yes, this is what came out as a product of the effort. Maybe we should use that as the stepping stone for the next search and do a good job. We all ought to feel proud that when the chips were down, we were there. I believe that all that I've been trying to put together is the fact that we would want to help with the support of the WPI to prevent Africa from just being the global laborer, as it were. But Africa should be a global partner. And it is that partnership that ought to be the watchword for the WPI in this whole idea of trying to find certain kinds of technological issues for a certain kind of innovation on the African continent. It is a big continent. And I'm happy that the WPI is very much involved in Ghana. Because the one thing that I would want to leave you with as a geographer is that, see, if you stood at the center of the earth, which for me is the intersection of the Greenwich Meridian and the equator, Ghana is about 3 degrees to the north of the equator. And the Greenwich Meridian runs through Ghana. So at that spot, whichever direction that you move, Ghana is going to be the first country you hit, which means irrespective of your religious beliefs, you ought to sometimes think about the possibility that when God was doing the business, God was standing on Ghanaian soil. That is where the effort ought to begin. And I'm glad that WPI is subscribing to that view. I would want to thank you for the gift of your attention this morning. And I do hope that we've sort of initiated a certain kind of dialogue that will help us propel the whole idea of WPI getting into some kind of wonderful relationship with the African continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. That very inspiring, thoughtful, and candid talk about the relationships that we can develop through our friendships, through our shared goals, and through our understanding of one another. There are a couple of questions that have been asked by our audience, and I'd like to pass those on to you right now. One person asks, or thanks you for your focused insight of the socioeconomic standards on the continent. And he believes that, or they believe that the timing is in our favor to bring parity to the rest of the world. Can you comment on President Nana's ambitious country financing roadmap with the support of the World Economic Forum and the OECD in a public-private partnership to increase the manufacturing capacity and high-value services to increase Ghana's economic output? Do you see this as sustainable development? Do you see this sustainable development target may be supported by the Global School at WPI?
Yeah, I believe that it is a sustainable position to take, because whatever it is that we do in terms of partnerships, we at the moment are not in a position to more or less finance everything that we would want to get involved in. So a certain kind of private public partnership is always going to be very advisable. What bothers me about it is the fact that sometimes in trying to fashion these public-private relationships, the private partner, who usually is coming from some kind of a Western nation or something, the minute that you mention Africa, the first thing they think about are problems, that they might lose money and all that. But the thing is, in my life, I have not come across one company from anywhere which can claim that they invested in Africa and they lost. Except, of course, the few people who normally go to Africa and they want to be, clever by half. And therefore, when everybody knows these days, I say the price of an ounce of gold on the world market is, for argument's sake, $20. He goes in there and somebody offers him an ounce of gold for $10. And he also probably might want to buy an ounce of gold for less than that. Now, anybody who is offering you an ounce of gold for $10, obviously, would have something up his or her sleeve. And one ought to be, you see, it's a matter of a certain kind of honesty in economic relationships. I will tell you this story during the World War. When the Europeans felt that Germany was going to run, over, the Western Europe, the Irish, left potato farming and then, came to the US. And then also when the Japanese were trying to run over, Malaysia and such, there was the problem of finding rubber to handle the aircrafts and such that they were using in the war effort. In the case of, the Irish, the potatoes that fed the British Army was grown in Ghana in a town called Nsuta. And of course, because the British wanted to buy it at the lowest possible price, after the war, people didn't see why they should continue producing potatoes, especially where it wasn't more or less a main meal for them. So the potato industry died in Ghana. Insofar as the rubber was concerned, most of the rubber was tapped in the Ashanti region. Now, one of the staple food in the Ashanti region is called fufu, which is pounded plantain or pounded yam or something like that. Now, when the purchasers came to buy the rubber, British traders imposed themselves as middlemen. So they negotiate, say, $20 with the army, and then they come and offer $7 to the rubber tappers. And somehow the rubber tappers recognized what was going on. And you see, the British traders had an association called the Association of West African Merchants. So in my language, there's a word called AWAM, which is the acronym for Association of West African Merchants. And AWAM means where, for instance, somebody nobbles the referee in a match to make sure that the referee makes sure that his or her team wins. So it's a collusion kind of thing. And when the Ashantis recognized that, what do? They pounded fufu and then wrapped it in rubber, because the rubber was bought by weight. So that is why then they sold to the middlemen. And then they went and sold them to the British Army. In the end, they found out that most of the rubber that they got at that time basically was a small percentage of the weight at which they bought them. So fortunately, the war was also coming to an end. So the British merchants lost the trade because of the fact that they weren't being honest brokers. So we would want people to have a certain kind of settled view that you want to put in an honest investment for an honest return. And in a place like Ghana, the laws are very protective of the investor. So I think, part of the issue, the success of this private, public partnership is going to be the result of the level of honesty on either side. But I can assure everybody, and not because I'm the ambassador of Ghana, but I do know that for a fact, that the laws protecting, investors are so tight that the investor can only lose if the, business in itself is supremely badly managed. So I would encourage, most people to participate in it, because once we have that partnership, we create jobs, and then we take in a lot of the teeming, population of younger people who are looking for jobs that, either don't exist, or they are looking for jobs which maybe might not contribute too much to the revival of the economy and the expansion of the economy. So, the investors should just be, as it were, not so much speculative. Because let's remind ourselves that the people who originally went to Africa to explore and exploit Africa, they were never invited. They just came because they saw an opportunity. This time, we are doing the invitation, and we certainly are not inviting anybody only to make sure that the person's arms are seized off. So I think we are on the right path, and we would want people to invest confidence, in us, for us to be able to do what we would want to do. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Your Excellency. That was a very thorough and thoughtful answer. We're going to have time for one more question, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break.
Sure.
But it looks like we have a question from a Ghanaian student based upon the name, and it says, "Hello, Dr. Barfuor. What do you think African students at WPI can contribute toward the fruition of this mission?"
What African students can contribute
to the fruition of the mission that you've laid out?
Well, I think African students would have to, one, take the opportunity at being at WPI and actually put a lot of energies into their studies and their expertise, just so that their competence level is never going to be questioned. Two, there is the tendency amongst African students that once they have a qualification, they tell themselves, why don't I just stay here? Because I'll get a job, and when I go home, maybe it's going to take me a while to get a job, and that kind of thing. So they hesitate. And the minute you hesitate for a year, I can assure you, you would hesitate for a decade. Because I know that, for instance, there are lots of, people who migrated to Britain, from Ghana in the 60s. And the story is that when they get there, the first thing they do is to buy themselves a briefcase and tell themselves that, well, I'm just packing my things in because I know that I'm going back home in 6 months. 45 years later, they still have that briefcase, that suitcase with whatever they purchased in it, because they haven't been home for that, length of time. So there is a tendency for one to, as it were, overplay the stay. But if you put yourself, in a bit of a perspective and look at the fact that you have a certain kind of skill that can benefit, Africa. And then you even realize that in your case, you even have an institution that, to a large extent, doesn't need to associate with, your kind of country, but they are associated. Then you owe it to both your country and yourself to, as it were, go and immerse yourself in the effort on the African continent. But most of the time, we look at the standard of life as against the quality of life. And therefore, the person tells himself or herself, well, if I stay there, I'll be earning so much. I'll be, I'll have access to this, access to this. And some people are even distressed because they go home and they realize that they cannot get up and walk, a quarter of a kilometer to a huge department store selling virtually everything. That isn't how African merchandise is handled. But people find a difficulty in getting, involved in whatever it is that their country's socioeconomic situation is concerned. So the first thing they do is to complain about the quality of roads and such, when they themselves, maybe for about 10 years, have never paid tax in the countries that they are talking about. But it is very necessary for African students to actually have a determination that their best contribution would be on the soil of the countries that initially gave them birth or brought them here. I'm no saint or anything, but when I graduated from Indiana, I was so determined to get home so fast that before I defended my thesis, I shipped my things home. And then I ran into a problem with my thesis advisor who wanted me to amend a very short paragraph in the thesis. And I decided that, look, as far as that particular subject or the dissertation was concerned, I knew more than anybody on the planet, so I'm not changing it. It's a matter of, attitude or difference of opinion between us. He said, in that case, he wasn't signing for it to be defended. I said, fine. So for a whole semester, I was doing virtually nothing. So I enrolled in typing, judo, and swimming, just to while away the time. Now, as soon as he relented, and then I left for home, irrespective of the fact that I had about 3 job offers, 2 in Florida, and then 1, interestingly, in Louisiana. And I just left. So my course advisor asked me, why? These jobs are very good jobs. And I said, well, I believed that the country that I left was going to be better than the US. So I don't see why I should be staying. And then 2, I missed my mom. So these were 2 critical, reasons why I left. But I think everybody's situation is going to be different. But I do know that most of the African students who graduate from here first think about their personal conveniences as opposed to what is it that they believe their countries could gain from the knowledge they've acquired and from the experiences that they have acquired in trying to improve on their own country's circumstances. So I would rather ask them or appeal to them that make going home your first priority, because somewhere along the line, I always remember James Brown, who went and opened a fast food outfit in Macon, Georgia. And somebody, but Macon, Georgia, there are too many of these things that, and then he says, a man goes where somebody knows his first name. And I think most of the African students should take a cue from that. And this time is ripe for people to go to Africa because we need that expertise. Go and drive some of the engine, and you'll be very happy you did.